Hey everybody, welcome to lesson number 4 in this Bible study unit we are calling The Beauty of Restoration. It is a study of the last few chapters of the Gospel of John, and more specifically, the last few days and weeks of Jesus' ministry. There is a listening guide for this lesson. You're going to need it. You'll find it the same place you found this video. Just scroll down, click on that link. It's a PDF that you can download to your computer and print out. There are some blanks to fill in during the teaching portion of the lesson, and then there are some discussion questions there for you and your family or your small group to go through together afterwards. You will also need your Bible open to John chapter 19 or your Bible app. We're going to be looking specifically today at verses 5 through 16. Before we jump into the lesson, let's pray, shall we? It's a hard picture for us to look at, Father. The passion of Christ. It's eye-opening, it's jarring, it's difficult for us, and yet we understand, Father, that it's all a part of the extraordinary price that Jesus paid for our restoration, and we want to understand what that means. So even in the midst of this broken world, Father, and even not only in spite of, but perhaps because of our own failures and struggles, we are all in need of restoration. So would you help us to understand what that looks like? Even today, as we open your word, would you open our hearts? Would you change how we see ourselves, how we see you, how we understand the world around us? Would you change all of that more and more until we have become the people that you've called us to become? We love you, Lord. We love your word and its place in our lives, and we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. Restoration, putting something that has failed back into its original state that its creator or its user intended it to be in. Spiritual restoration then is this idea of putting us back into a love relationship with God, the relationship that we were intended to be with Him in the first place. We are walking through the final days of Jesus' ministry, His arrest, His trial, his scourging, his crucifixion, His resurrection. We're walking through all of that, and week after week we're asking the question, what does this show us about restoration? What does it teach us? And we are spending 3 weeks, this is the third week, looking at Jesus before Pilate, because so much happened in that interaction between Jesus and Pilate, and then in the interaction between Pilate and the Jewish leaders. We're on week 3 of that, again in John chapter 19, verses 5 through 16 today. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen restoration from the perspective of its connection with truth and how critical and foundational truth is to restoration. And then last week we saw the connection between restoration and suffering and how there's a connection there. This week we're going to be looking at what I refer to as a mob mentality, or the dangers of groupthink. How dangerous that can be, how that can lead us away from truth, and that can actually cause us to let go of Jesus if we're not careful. So we're going to look at that this week. Jesus was tried through the night by Caiaphas and the high priest and through the Jewish leaders, and then they took him to Pilate the following morning. The Jewish leaders were technically not allowed to put anyone to death, and that's what they wanted here. Make no mistake about that. They wanted Jesus put to death. They were technically not allowed to do that. Moreover, they probably didn't want to be the ones to put him to death. They didn't want it to happen at their hand, probably, because he was so popular with the crowds. They feared, I suspect they were fearful of how that would make them look. They really wanted Pilate to be the one to do this, it seems, and so they're really pressing him. We have already seen Pilate interrogate Jesus and come to the conclusion that, in his mind anyway, in Pilate's mind, Jesus has done nothing deserving of death. He's not done anything wrong. He finds him innocent. We also seen this conversation between Pilate and Jesus. We saw it get pretty personal at times, and by that I mean pretty intimate to Pilate, as conversations with Jesus were prone to do. We've seen Pilate then bow to the political correctness of the circumstances. He is make no mistake, being much more driven by political correctness than he is by truth or by righteousness or by goodness or by anything like that. And so he, in bowing to the political correctness, he has now had Jesus scourged. That happened last week, perhaps hoping that after the Jewish leaders had seen that would have been enough for them, that would have satisfied their bloodthirst, so to speak. It did not. And so we pick up today where we left off last week in John chapter 19. We finished last week with verse 5, but we're going to go back and pick up verse 5 again this week and then come forward. Here's what it sounds like beginning with verse 5. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself out as the Son of God." All right, let's stop here and unpack. First of all, we recognize clearly this is what we would refer to as a mob. This is the villagers with pitchforks and torches in their hands. This is definitely a mob mentality. It seems ironically inconsistent, doesn't it? This mob with the mob that showed up to greet Jesus on Palm Sunday as he came into town. They seem like two completely different crowds, and in truth, they may well have been completely different crowds. Now, we have no reason to believe that the crowd that greeted Jesus on Palm Sunday and cheered Hosanna, Hosanna is the same people that we're dealing with in this case. In this case, it seems to be a crowd, a mob that was fabricated and put together by the Jewish leaders in order to accomplish what they're doing. The Palm Sunday crowd, on the other hand, was probably more of an ad hoc crowd that just happened, that simply materialized naturally. But this crowd, no, this was very carefully manicured and fabricated and manipulated by these very Jewish leaders who want Jesus dead. They literally created this mob outside of Pilate's palace in order to make this demonstration of political power. Note the inconsistency, however, in terms of the charges that they're bringing against Jesus. It's been quite a journey listening to what exactly they're charging him with. The first time Pilate asked them, what are the charges? They didn't have an answer. They didn't even answer the question. They just told him, just trust us. He's been a bad person and he needs to be put to death. Secondly, after that then, when Pilate balked at crucifixion and they could see that he was balking, they needed to pressure him into doing it. And so what they said to Pilate was, he's claiming to be a king. And because he's claiming to be a king, he is therefore a threat to Caesar, and you have no choice but to put him to death. Note what they've said this time. This time, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself to be the Son of God. So this is the third attempt at coming up with some kind of a charge. And now the charge is that Jesus has violated Jewish law, that is, committed blasphemy by claiming to be the Son of God. What is the point here I'm making? The point is, mob mentality doesn't need logical thinking. Mob mentality doesn't need consistency. Mob mentality just wants what it wants. It doesn't need to be rational. There doesn't have to be anything rational about it. The mob just wants what it wants. And as is so often the case with politics, truth has become irrelevant. These Jewish political leaders' attitude was that the truth is whatever we say it is, whatever we tell you it is, that's the truth. It doesn't have to make any sense. Trust us, we determine what the truth is here, and if it changes from one moment to the next, pay no attention to that. We will determine what truth is. And so as God's people, the lesson here is we really have to be better than this. As God's people, we've got to be careful in terms of how we handle truth and our connection with truth. And we cannot be associated as God's people with things that are twisting and bending the truth to the point that it's no longer even recognizable. If you have your listening guide, let's fill in the first statement on your listening guide. For God's people, truth must be deeper and more profound than mere political sound bites or marketing slogans. When we allow truth to be hijacked by shallow mob mentality, we trade its inherent spiritual power for cheap worldly power. And we don't want anything to do with that as God's people. We've got to be standing on a much broader, profound basis of truth than what political sound bites or marketing ploys give us. So be careful. We have to be careful with that. Something new then is here for Pilate to now explore, because for the first time they've said, this man claims to be the Son of God. That seems to have gotten Pilate's attention. Look what it says next, beginning in verse 8. When Pilate heard this statement, that is, that Jesus claims to be the Son of God, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" And Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." What an interesting question. It says Pilate is bothered by this statement that Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God, and so he goes and asks him, what? What question would you ask? If you wanted to explore that statement, what question would you ask? It probably wouldn't be, "Where are you from?" But that's the question Pilate asks, "Where are you from?" It seems to me that what he's doing here is he's being influenced probably by Roman spirituality itself, by the gods and Mount Olympus and "Are you a son of Zeus?" and that kind of thing. That's really the only frame of reference Pilate would have for a god or gods or being the son of a god. And so what he's asking here is, how did you get here? Where did you come from? Because all of his stories and understandings about sons of God would have meant somehow his creation would have been a godly thing, would have come from Zeus himself or from Mount Olympus. And so that seems to be what he's exploring here. But it's not a question Jesus was afraid of. He doesn't answer the question, but it's not because he's afraid to answer that question. Previously in Jesus' ministry, he's been very open about where he came from. In a couple of different places, just in John's Gospel alone, we can go back to John chapter 3 or John chapter 6. Both of those are places where Jesus said very clearly that he had come from his Father in heaven, that he had been sent by his Father in heaven. And so this is not a question he's afraid of. Perhaps the reason Jesus didn't say anything here is because at this point, all of the circumstances seem to be headed in the direction that he knows God wants these circumstances headed. It's on the right track. He is headed towards crucifixion, which is exactly where he needs to be headed. Why would he say anything or do anything to try to change that when everything's moving in the direction that it should be moving? Pilate tries to force Jesus to talk, tries to manipulate him into saying something by reminding him of just who he's talking to here. "You know, Jesus, I have the authority to let you go, to release you, or to crucify you. Don't you think it would be in your best interest to talk to me?" Jesus, however, gives him a different perspective. Look at what Jesus says. "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above." What Jesus is doing here is this is another reference to his kingdom, his spiritual kingdom, which is above and beyond and greater than anything Pilate can imagine here on earth. It is a higher authority. And so what he's noting here is that Pilate is a puppet and is being dictated by a higher authority. That's the only reason he has any of the authority that he has in the first place. Jesus also implies that for this reason, Pilate's sin in participating in this kangaroo court, his sin is actually less, because all he's doing is what God wants him to do. All he's doing is following the orders, following the authority that he's been given to do, as opposed to others who have played a part in this whole process that have had what Jesus terms as a greater sin. Who is Jesus referring to when he says, "The one who turned me over to you is a greater sin"? I think it's an interesting reference an interesting reference, but I think that it is probably a reference to Judas. Judas was not following any authority. Judas was acting out of his own heart, out of his own will. He was in turning Jesus over. And so this is an interesting reference. We saw this from Jesus often in his ministry. It's an interesting reference to his upside down kingdom. His kingdom is so upside down from this world. In his kingdom, the least shall be first and the first shall be least. You know all of that. And in the kingdom of God, Pilate holds a position of lower authority than even Judas himself. And so Pilate's sin in this case is not as great as Judas's sin. This is an important reminder about the standards by which spiritual restoration is measured. What I'm saying here is that if sin itself is measured differently in God's eyes than it is in our eyes, if our failures for which we need restoration are measured differently, are seen differently from God than they are in this world, then doesn't that necessarily mean that restoration likewise is going to be seen differently and look different in God's eyes than it does in the world's eyes? If you have your listening guide, let's fill in the next statement on your listening guide. Spiritual failure is not measured by the world's standards, but by God's standards. Spiritual restoration, then, often will not look like the world thinks it should look. What an important takeaway about restoration. All right, so what Pilate wants is just to let Jesus go. It's just to release him. Look what it says next, beginning in verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release Jesus. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." Political manipulation there. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. And now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." What Pilate wants here is to release Jesus. But the Jewish leaders have effectively taken that option off the table for him because remember, he is being driven almost completely by political correctness. And these Jewish leaders have created a circumstance that make it impossible now for him to release Jesus. To release Jesus would probably cause a riot, and that is the last thing Pilate can afford to happen under his watch. The heat is on him from Rome to keep the peace in this province. So that would not bode well for Pilate. If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. They had Pilate over a barrel politically. He knows he has to make a decision, so he goes to the judgment seat. He tries one more time to place Jesus in the hands of these Jewish leaders. Behold your king. Take your king. In other words, he's yours to do with as you wish. And unfortunately for Pilate, where Jesus is concerned, making no decision at all, refusing to make a decision, is actually a decision in itself. And that's exactly how it was for Pilate. That's exactly how it is for all of us. This is a perfect example of the very personal question each of us and all of us face during this lifetime, and that is, what will I do with Jesus? No matter how hard we might try to avoid this question, there simply is no avoiding this question in this lifetime. Our standing before God for eternity depends on how we answer that question. There is no avoiding it, and there was no avoiding it for Pilate either. If you have your listening guide, let's fill in the third statement on your listening guide. What will I do with Jesus? For each of us, there is more riding on my answer to this question than I can possibly fathom. And there is no getting out of this life without an answer. On to verse 15 then. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. And so he delivered him over to them to be crucified. I wonder how Herod might have felt if they had heard these Jewish leaders screaming, we have no king but Caesar. Herod was deemed the king of the Jews by the Roman Empire. It's fair to say that a full-blown mob mentality has at this point taken over this crowd. They aren't even being rational. They don't care who hears what they have to say at this point. It's worth stopping and looking at this disconnect between what they thought they were doing and what they were actually doing. I think it's important to stop here, drill down on this, and really look at this. What they thought, what these Jewish leaders thought they were doing was serving God. What they thought they were doing was saving their faith, at least as they understood it. They thought that this man Jesus posed a threat to their faith, that is, to their religious way of life, and to God himself. So they thought they were standing up for God. They thought they were protecting what God wanted protecting. And it was somehow their responsibility to get rid of Jesus, to make sure he does not threaten what God wants standing. All of this in their mind was for God. In actuality, look at what was happening. In actuality, they were giving up on the Son of God in order to preserve the social and political power which they had mistaken for godliness. There is definitely a lesson here for all of us as we look at the culture wars that are going on around us. Above all, what I mean by that is just that if we're not careful, our desire to hold on to the powers of this world, political power and social power and economic power, our desire to hold on to this, we can convince ourselves that we're doing it for God, that it's a godly thing, but if we're not careful, we can actually lose Jesus in the midst, the real Jesus in the midst of all of this. Now, above all of that nastiness that's going on, is a sovereign God. And I always want to come back to this and always want to remind us of the larger spiritual picture here. A sovereign God using all of this nastiness in order to actually achieve what he wants to happen. I'm reminded in Acts chapter 4, at a point when the early church is gathering to pray, and they're praying about this, and they're talking about this very idea. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 27, listen to what it says. This is the people, the early church praying. This is what they prayed to God. They were talking about how the kings of this world, the powers of this world, will actually come to bear against Jesus, against what is the real Jesus. And they'll think they're doing it for good. They'll think it's good, but it's actually going to be operating against Jesus. Listen to how they pray. They say, "In fact, Lord, this has happened here in this very city. For Herod Antipas, Pontius Pilate, the governor, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel were all united against Jesus, your holy servant, whom you anointed." They prayed this prayer to God, but listen to what they said. "But everything they did was determined beforehand according to your will." So they even acknowledged that above all of this ugliness that we can learn from, and these are important things for us to learn, but above all of this is this sovereign God using it all to accomplish his will. Never lose sight of that. So while we're not losing sight of that larger picture of God's will regarding these events, we can still look at this mob and look at this crowd, this groupthink, and we can see ourselves in this. We can see our own shortcomings in many of these characters. One of those shortcomings in this particular tragedy is this inadvertently giving up Jesus in order to have what our mob has convinced us is godliness. We're giving up Jesus in order to have what our mob mentality has convinced us is godliness, and we must be very careful about that. If you have your listening guide, let's fill in the last statement. The danger, of course, in tightly bundling our faith with our cultural expressions of faith is that we lose the distinction between them and end up giving up Jesus for what our mob mentality tells us is godliness. So what are our takeaways here today about this mob mentality? Number one, truth must be deeper and more profound than the mere political sound bites and marketing slogans of a mob. It must be deeper and more profound than that. Number two, God's perspective on failure is different from ours, and therefore his perspective on restoration will be different from ours too. It probably won't look like the world thinks it should look. Number three, universal question, what will I do with Jesus? We all have to answer that question, and we all have whatever our lifetime is in order to figure out that answer. And number four, mob mentality can actually cause us to give up Jesus in order to preserve our cultural expressions of faith. And we've got to be able to separate the two of those and be careful about that. These are some of my takeaways from this passage. I wonder what yours are. I love you guys. I hope you have a blessed week this week, and we will pick up right here where we've left off next week. I'll see you next time.